I'll let each of the panelists do their own introduction and some background in terms of their areas. But we have Brent Sutton from Safety Associates, Anthony Mahoney from the IT psychiatrist, and John Williams from HealthPoint. So the discussion we're going to talk about today is key learnings from recent disasters on future crisis management. And in the current climate and the pandemic, and we've had a number of largish disasters over recent years. Prior to this, in the preparation, we were listing out a few of them, from Auckland Harbour Bridge water crisis. We've got the mosque attack. We've had a number of big earthquakes over recent years. If you go back far enough, we've got the power crisis, a little bit similar to our water crisis. We've got Pike River volcanic eruption, which, you know, that could have been a lot worse than it was, but unfortunately, you know, a number of people passed away. So a number of disasters that have impacted people either at a local level or at a national level, and COVID-19 has triggered many risks over many areas. So I won't take any more of their time. I'll pass over to the panelists to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Okay, guys. So my name's Brent Sutton. I specialise in workplace fatalities and major harm management. So I'm sort of, you know, like the dead guy that they bring in to talk about. I conduct seances, not rather than investigations, to understand what went wrong. And, you know, from my perspective, you know, the future is always uncertain. Therefore, the next disaster is just waiting to happen. And what COVID-19 has reinforced to me is that systems will always be brittle and people are resilient and adaptable. So that's part of the thing I'll be focusing on.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Williams, and I'm the COO for a company based in New Zealand called HealthPoint. And we manage 2 software platforms around emergency response and business continuity planning, with specific target audiences in mind. And so we deal with more the small end of town rather than the big organisations. And, you know, my view is, and we look at all sorts of risks when it comes to SMEs, small to medium enterprises. In Australia, we've got a platform. We work with the Royal Australian College of GPs, and we profile GP practices and help them build an online emergency response plan, because the community is so dependent on primary care should anything go wrong. Now, part of that has been there's a module in there specifically for pandemics. And obviously with recent occurrences, that's been a big focus. So how do you actually gear yourself up as a small organisation to deal with some of these things? And it's not so much preventing them from happening, it's about what do you do to get your business up and running again as quickly as possible, because you can lose brand reputation, or, you know, years and years of building that up. You need to keep in the case of a GP practice, you need to keep your patients safe. So how do you deal with that? You need to keep your staff safe. And in places like Victoria and New South Wales now, as we move forward, there's a state government requirement that every organisation has a COVID safe plan. And what that means is they need to prepare for future on how they're going to keep their staff, their customers or their patients safe. And so we're going to build that into that particular software platform. And then on the other side for SMEs, our platform there, we work very strongly with insurance companies, because if you've got an organisation small that's thinking about this stuff, including cyber risk, it mitigates the risk for the insurer. So it's a slightly different view, but it's about small organisations taking on board and putting a plan in place and thinking about it organisationally and training staff on it.
Thanks, John. So I'm Anthony McMahon. My background's not fully risk. I come from a technology background, but technology and risk are very comfortable bedfellows. I did spend a lot of my career in a corporate world at BNZ, where I did have a risk role as well. There's a few people in the room who I did work with. And one of the things I found there was that tech and risk, they're not just good bedfellows, they're actually almost the same thing. And one of the things that technology often is the cause of, but also the answer to many of our problems that we're seeing out there. And if we look at COVID, if we look at some of the other impacts, the bridge being a key one, and I'm going to talk in the next slot a little bit more about the bridge because there's some other risks in there that we didn't quite see happen, which is good. But technology was a way for businesses to work through, but only when they knew what they were doing and only when they had a good partner in place that could help them deliver that. So my focus, or where I am now, I'm an independent IT consultant, and I brand myself as a virtual chief technology officer. So there's, again, that linkage back to risk and making sure that companies are actually investing the right amount. I use Goldilocks and the 3 bears as the example. They can't be too little, they can't be too much. It's got to be just right. They've got to be investing enough so that when the next harbour bridge or the next volcano or the next pandemic happens, their staff can just wake up, turn their laptop on, and start working and helping their customers and helping their people around them as well.
Okay, so we'll open it to some questions for the panelists to explore this topic. Maybe I'll open it with an initial question first while others are thinking, and then I'll move around and bring the mic to you. So one of my questions is thinking back 1998 with the power cut that we had in Auckland. One of the things I thought was interesting doing my studies from the UK is that example, and some of the lessons from there is being taught to risk practitioners right over the world. So, and one of the things that struck me was some of the businesses that thought they were resilient and were able to keep working even with the power cut, found that none of their customers were, and it basically cut their whole revenue, because even though they were still standing, their diversity was such that they lost their entire customers because they only had 1 or 2 customers, and that kind of wiped them out. So in terms of preparation, clearly with, disasters and the likes, you've got to think a bit wider than just your own organisation. So maybe I'll just open that as a discussion starter. How do you get businesses to think a little bit wider than their own kind of points? So over to you guys.
Well, I think the first thing about that era, thank God it was pre-internet, because the reliance on systems wasn't as high as what they are now, which is obviously what we've downside to see it. I think part of all this problem is that when these events happen, despite all the planning, we take an emotional response to events in that way, and that very much clouds our view about how we see things. And as a society, New Zealand was one of the first developed countries in the OEC to do mass contracting out relationships. So the good idea when telecom got split and they moved to the whole independent contractor model in the early 90s, but we didn't understand what was at risk where we started to break up that supply chain. And I think that's been part of it. So we've had like 30 odd years of this convenience that's now come back to bite us.
Yeah, again, taking a slightly different view on that, on the whole topic, and I'll use health again as an example because that's where our focus is, although we are in other areas as well. But I think back not that long ago actually, and there was a power outage in Auckland, and in specific areas around Auckland, and I'll qualify that by talking about general practices. So general practice, okay, fine, they were able to keep functioning because they did have power, but a community laboratory down the road may not have. Or another practice down the road lost power, and therefore, without taping their vaccine fridges down, taping the doors down, they get spoilage. So you can save vaccines for up to 6 hours with the doors taped. But unless you've actually got a plan in place to think about that and to mitigate those sorts of things happening, and you've trained your staff to do that, you have all these dependencies that are so important on one another because you're supporting your community. So that's just one example.
And I think last week I was listening to the managing director at Smith & Smith talking and about the impacts on her business during COVID. And one of the things she talked about was a big part of revenue for Smith & Smith is stone chip repairs on windscreens. If no one's driving, no one's breaking a window, no one's been repaired. So they got hit quite hard, but then they actually, I think she said it was within week 2 or week 3, they got reclassified as an essential business, but it was a caveat. They were an essential business doing essential repairs for essential services. So if an ambulance showed up with a stone chip, they could fix it. But if the ambulance station had its window broken, they couldn't. So they had to plan for all of that as well. And one of the things I've been exploring a lot over the last 12 or 18 months is the concept of digital twins. And some of you may be familiar with a digital twin, but it's, if you think of the old, the clay models that car manufacturers used to make, where they put a clay model together of the car, throw it in the wind tunnel, and then start to measure everything around it and just shave it off and shave bits off and shave bits off. And eventually they had the car they were going to build, and they built off that. That's the same concept of a digital twin. It's where you model your organisation on everything you've got, all your streams of revenue, all your customers, all your systems, your people, and your process, and you can start to see what happens when you take one away. So you've got a very real world scenario that you can model, take it away, see the impacts, and then you can start to, as John said, start to plan for that and have that plan in place. If you know that your customer base is predicated on everyone driving and no one can drive, what should you be thinking of in advance? So that's something I think companies of all sizes can start to prepare for, is not just with a digital twin, but just understand what their business model looks like.
Yeah.
But there was also an upside to risks, because although someone like Smith & Smith took a big hit, every battery company in New Zealand sold out. Every automotive dealership could not keep up with demand. Make sense? So every risk must have an up and a downside, which hopefully balances out.
Spot on. And that's something they could have modelled as well. You know, Smith & Smith and Marshall could be sitting together going, right, well, if no one's driving, what does it mean for you? What does it mean for us? Straight away, they've got a case study there.
Any questions from the floor we want to?
We can make stuff up.
I can always throw in some more, but I don't think that's all the questions.
Using the heading of the panel, it says key learnings from recent disasters on future crisis management. So based on that heading, based off COVID, what's your key learn? So I'm the CEO, I've invited you in. What's the one thing you're going to tell me I need to be thinking about to future-proof myself?
Look, for me, it's really simple. I think earlier I said that COVID-19 proved that systems were brittle. No system could cope with what occurred. But it also proved that people were highly adaptable as well. But what was interesting was the fact that it was the management layer and the senior leadership layer that struggled the most in that space, not the workers themselves. And this came back down to the fact that we need to build that resilience capability amongst our management teams and leadership teams. And that resilience component is a skill. And not a lot of money is invested in building skills at those levels. So a lot of what I saw was the fact that people were being left to their own devices. And even to the extent that we had this whole thing about people working from home was a classic example. All the phone calls WorkSafe were getting were things around, how should I set up my workstation? Okay, I've got to ask you, how's the workstation going to kill you compared to COVID-19? Whereas what those people really wanted is they wanted a rich conversation, because what people were being faced with for the very first time was uncertainty. And we saw that behaviour of uncertainty. Do you remember how much toilet paper we sold out? Great for every New Zealand manufacturer, but I didn't know that you died from diarrhea with COVID-19. Okay, I didn't know that an outcome of COVID-19 was that amount of toilet paper. So behaviour of people, and we call it risk homeostasis, the behaviour of people was simply that they tried to get control back. And part of organisations, I won't say the word failure because I don't like using the word failure, but what organisations need to learn from a learning perspective was how do they help to create that resilience layer? Because it's a question of the next pandemic, not if. And, you know, I was a swine flu, you know, H1N1. I got my first medal for that, and I'm waiting for my next one.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's there's an interesting twist in here, and it's almost going back to good organisational processes and understanding how your organisation works and who's involved in it. And I'll give you a specific example. So in the medical area, planning for pandemics is nothing new. You know, and I look at our platform in Australia, it's always had a pandemic planning section in it, but it was specifically focused on influenza. Now in 2017, you know, in Australia, for example, nearly 2,000 people died of influenza, right? Much higher than the rate of deaths currently in Australia under COVID-19, but you didn't hear about it. And you didn't understand who was involved in your organisation. Now with the COVID-19 situation and putting a plan in place that covers everything from, you know, how you communicate an unplanned event through to making sure that you've got all the hygiene processes in place. You've got an immunisation register of all your employees, you know, do you offer flu vax, that kind of thing. Understanding everybody that works for you and what their family circumstances are, I think is a really important thing to understand, because what you've got is you've got people at home with immune compromised or elderly people that they are providing care for. Unless you know that, you're not going to know how they feel. And I don't know what most of you are like. I know in our small organisation, when COVID-19 first hit, we had so many different responses to it. Some people panicked and just freaked out and wouldn't go anywhere near public transport or do anything like that, versus the others were a little more nonchalant about it. So you get various responses. And my first thing would be to understand my people better and their circumstances to then plan more effectively.
Definitely. I think John's covered really well with the people there. The other side I'd be looking at is sitting down with that CEO and saying, look, are you spending the right things on the right amount on the right places? And have you actually adequately mapped out what your risk is? And we talked about the internet before with the power cut. But for businesses, again, needing to map out and understanding what critical systems they have and what dependencies they are. How many people in the room are on Office 365 in their business? So for those of you, how did that global outage they had 2 weeks ago go down? Impact of productivity, impact of loss of work. That's the same thing that could happen with the cloud. And it shows how unresilient cloud technologies can be, because they are dependent on something Microsoft did. That was a change in their regard, or access to the internet. And if you take that away, you might be taking away your ability to actually do work. So again, is your transformational program that the business might be looking at going to solve the risks that you've got today, or is it going to create a whole new level of risks that you haven't even thought about yet? Because that is what's going to happen.
Well, look at the stock exchange. Someone highly innovative said, now's the right opportunity to take advantage. Make sense?
Yeah.
And, you know, our response was pretty average.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or probably the worst one for me than the stock exchange is the entire contact tracing in the UK is run on an Excel spreadsheet. You know, this is stuff that we've known for 30 years that doesn't work, and yet we're still doing it. So it's invest in that, or spend in the right areas and spend the right amount as well.
Our one wasn't much better to begin with.
I think the other thing that's worth pointing out too, in terms of organisational learning, it's training your organisation to think more holistically about unplanned events, right? And making sure, and cyber's a really good example, right? If you've got a cyber response plan and you've built in some cyber security policies, for goodness sake, train everybody in your organisation about that. Because I don't know about you, but you know, we probably get 9 or 10 phishing emails every week into the organisation. You just need one slip up and your whole systems are compromised. So train, and everything, I think, is an important aspect.
Do you think as a nation that we understand global threats and the impacts on our nation well enough to be prepared and prepared for? So, you know, thinking about transnational crime, cyber, pandemics, black swan, you know, pressure on geopolitical incidents, disparity between rich and poor, you know, all of these. Do you think as a nation we understand the threat landscape as well as we should?
No.
Yeah. The fact that we're underinvesting in our water infrastructure in at least 2 of our major cities, Auckland and Wellington. You know, Auckland's running out of water, but Wellington's advantage is they've got several rivers they can just keep pumping from. We either don't understand it or we haven't bothered to investigate it as much as we could. And I think something I look at from a technology perspective a lot with businesses is Kiwis tend to take the she'll be right, mate attitude. Yeah, she'll be right, we'll be fine. We're a million miles away from anywhere. Well, yeah, but COVID still got here and the internet stopped working one day.
Yeah.
Or do we want to know? because sometimes that head in the sand is very comfy. Might be scratchy to begin with, but sometimes it's a very comfortable place to be because the world's scary at the moment.
Yeah, and I think I sort of support what Anthony said around complacency. You know, if you look at the small end of town, not the large organisations, and because I don't know that area that well, but certainly dealing in the SMEs and the smaller organisations, people just don't understand or haven't thought about any potential risks. So, and they don't think about the years that they've taken to build an organisation up, be it small, and, you know, the brand reputation and the impact on their customers. And, you know, if they can't bounce back from, I think I saw a figure somewhere, and you guys would know better than I, that something like 86% of small organisations that suffer a major unplanned event will not be in business in 2 years. So getting over that hump of complacency, I think, is really important. And it's about, you know, the more awareness you can get through working with insurers, you know, making risk mitigation part of that whole process as you go through. That's going to take time, but that will impact it for sure.
I mean, it's an interesting discussion, isn't it? I think, you know, with crisis management, it used to try and identify every single scenario under the sun and then have a specific action plan for a bomb threat or a pandemic or what have you. But, it, you know, from the conversation, and I think too, that it's more around people's capability, understanding, because we don't know what the next thing's going to be. What we want is a culture and people who can adapt and respond in an appropriate manner, perhaps pivot strategy, thinking about the risks as it goes. With the current move to working from home and I guess, you know, virtual workforces, do we think that changes, what sort of impacts do we think that might have or challenges that represents to ongoing, you know, that culture build as compared to the past where it was all, you know, probably more controlled in the office?
Yeah.
Look, I mean, one thing I can share with the group right now, the number of personal grievances claims, bullying claims, harassment claims have hugely increased to the extent that, you know, WorkSafe are looking at how they want to approach this because it's gone through the roof. And, you know, part of this thing is the fact that a lot of the planning that we do treats people as a group. It doesn't treat them as individuals. Yet each of us going through this massive change management process that we've been going through, each of us is different. And we haven't had our own individual plan of how we're going to adapt to what we call the new normal that exists. And I can't see what the new normal looks like because the future always remains uncertain in that capacity. But what's happening is that organisations haven't had that framework or that thinking model that they need to actually learn from it and be able to be agile and adapt as this thing continues to evolve and change. I don't believe there is going back to the old way. I don't know what that looks like. I mean, I'm flying tomorrow on my speaking circuit at the moment. First time I've flown since, you know, March the 12th. Okay, it's going to be interesting. I've got a lot of masks in my suit. I'll get up for it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question you ask. I mean, culture is really important in an organisation. I don't know about you, all you folks in here, whatever platform, digital platform you use to communicate, whether it's Zoom or it's Teams or it's GoToMeeting or whatever it is, I'm kind of fatigued about all of that because you know you're on it 4 or 5 times a day, and you just, you know, and the first lockdown and the second lockdown in Auckland, and you're just sick of it. So from my perspective, it's really important to get people together again so you can have that personal interaction and build that culture, because without it, it's much more difficult to do that. And that's an important component of it, is the human interaction that we all crave, really. And if you look at what's happening in Melbourne, my 2 daughters live in Melbourne, they've been there for 3 years. The mental health issues, the anguish, the stuff that, you know, the loss of jobs, the stuff that they're going through, right? The weekend they said, oh, heck, we've got restrictions lifted. We can now actually, we can travel within a 25-kilometre radius. We can see 10 people and that's it. So we're actually really lucky here because we can actually get back to some sort of normality. But my personal opinion about COVID-19 is that we need to contain it, not eliminate it. That's my personal opinion, because we just can't go on like this for too long. And if we do, we're going to lose a lot of that culture that organisations have built.
Definitely. And within it, there's a level of adaptability and communication and accountability. And if I do think of what the last 12 months have brought, we had the biggest work from home experiment the world's ever seen, and we proved that productivity doesn't change, and we proved that people can work unattended, and all the concerns with Zoom fatigue aside, because that's very real. The day or 3 days after the next business day from when the bridge broke, we still had people getting in their car and driving to work. So at no point had anyone made a conscious call within the business to say, look, stay at home, work from home. You've already done it for 3 months. You then did it for another, how long was that second one? Like there was another 6 months, wasn't it? Felt like it anyway. You've done it twice. You can do it again. And as the guys were talking, I was thinking back to when I was in high school years ago. I went to college down in Wellington, down in Upper Hutt, and our college had a river. The Hutt River was 2 k's from the school. And I remember one day where we had kids who had to cross the river to get home. There were kids that didn't have to cross the river, kids that did. Those kids got sent home at 12:30 because I'd looked at what was happening with the rain in the mountains, and that river was going to shut all the bridges down the length of the river. And for the school, it was better to have kids at home with their families than at the school where they had to try and deal with them. And I feel like in some cases, as we've grown older, some of our management, some of our decision-making sort of lost that foresight of let's get people home before the bridge shuts, or let's get them working from home while the bridge is shut.
That ability to look at the future and do the scenario testing, which you mentioned about the digital twins, and also Chris, you demonstrated earlier, that takes data and foresight to identify what those scenarios might be and how they might play out. Do you think companies are technically advanced to be able to do that? Or are we still seeing in the she'll be all right phase?
I think the answer is no, they're not technically advanced, and that's not a rundown on them. The role I play in that virtual chief technology officer role is to help them with that technical advancement. Doctors are doctors. They're good at helping people and healing people. They're not. I don't expect them to be able to stand up a IT infrastructure that's secure and stable and strong. So that's where you need to bring in the specialists that can help with it. And I think this one to me changes a little bit from the she'll be right. There's also a little bit of an aversion to invest to protect, if that makes sense. So I can name, I won't, but I can name several companies in New Zealand that are employee owned, shareholder owned. They don't invest where they need to because that takes money out of their back pocket. But the reality is if they invested, they'd have more money in their back pocket next year. So I think that's a big part of it, is people just need to start to realise what the future holds and not what the right now is doing for them, and be prepared to bring in those specialists. I mean, I've got a very narrow niche. There's others out there who have their own narrow niches. Let's all work together to help these companies get stronger and more resilient so that they can manage moving through.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that as well, and it's certainly for small organisations, most of them haven't got the skill or the thinking or the organisational learning to necessarily think through this stuff. So you have to help them. And when you help them, you need to make it simple and practical with some very specific tasks to actually implement or put into a plan, and not make it too complicated because they'll never do it. And when I look at the online platform we've got for both, so the small to medium enterprises across many industries and the ones specifically for general practices, you just take them through a series of steps and thinking, and they'll get it done, and they'll put a plan in place, and the lights will come on. If you think about in Australia where they've got notifiable data breach legislation, and you're talking about cyber, they need to be acutely aware if somebody steals their data, they're going to have to report that to the government, and they're going to get fined considerably. We haven't quite got that here in New Zealand. We might get a little bit of it through the privacy changes in the legislation, but taking them step by step through some simple things to prepare for that, it just makes it more effective, and you can get a good plan at the end of it. Even things like, if you think about Australia, the bushfire problem that they had at the end of 2019, beginning of this year, was horrific through southern New South Wales and into Victoria, and they have to prepare for that. So giving them some practical steps and not lots of big matrices and stuff. They won't do it. So make it really simple and easy to do is probably the lessons we've learned.
Maybe I'll just throw in another question while people are thinking. You know, we touched there on the mental health issues that are, you know, we've seen developing not only in New Zealand, but internationally. And I wonder how much of that is related to us, I guess, either as individuals or corporates not being able to handle uncertainty. Because, you know, with this pandemic starting to go around, you know, in New Zealand, we've only had 25 deaths, you know, very fortunately, through some good management and leadership. But that uncertainty, you know, scared a lot of people. And, you know, I've also seen people out walking by themselves wearing the mask, you know, just absolutely paranoid about getting the virus, even though there's nobody near them. And equally, you know, some of the structures that we've learned to depend on, like being able to go to the office to work, all of a sudden got taken away. And to some people, you know, that's just disconcerting. You know, I can't go to the office. You know, actually, they were fine. They, you know, once you got over that scary bit of the normal was no longer there, it's changed. Do we need to build more resilience in people to appreciate that even when things are uncertain, you know, things will be okay, or build up their capacity individually or within organisations to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, look, psychosocial risks are absolutely fascinating from my perspective, because 5 million people were traumatised. Okay, 5 million people got traumatised. Every one of us was traumatised when we had the first wave. And when we had the second community outbreak, it was completely normal for us to actually think back to what it was like the last time, and how that felt so overwhelming, and how that caused that anxiety in us, or that feeling that we had in our gut. Once again, that was completely normal because we have been traumatized by that process. What we don't do is that we don't have good strategies, we don't have good risk management strategies to deal with psychosocial risks. Organisations have been focusing on what I call the well-being bandwagon, okay, which to me is just visible stuff. It doesn't actually serve any frickin' purpose. You know, it's great to have a bowl of fruit in the office. I don't know how it improves my, you know, mental ability to adapt and change, but keep me more regular. I suppose that might be the outcome of it. And it's really interesting that the Canadians were the first country in the world to develop a risk management standard for psychosocial risks. And it's free for you to download. It's called Z1003. Yep, something like that. And it's free to download. And that standard they released 5 years ago, and it was just recently updated. And what it basically talked about is it said that how you approach these risks are completely different to how you would approach things that cause acute harm or things that cause, you know, disease or illnesses, because it's about the psychosocial component of it. And it basically said that there is no one way of fixing it. Okay, and the best thing we can do is to make these things more transparent, because they are highly complex. Psychosocial risks aren't complicated risks, they are complex risks, because they're about people and individuals. And all of us are on the scale. Do you know that in the room? You're all somewhere on the scale of being mental. You show me a normal person and yeah, they don't exist.
Show me a scale and, you know, you'll have attributes, you'd be close. Yeah.
Green, orange or red.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Look, I think it's a very interesting topic, and you look at what's happening with COVID-19 at the moment. And I think for most people, including here in New Zealand, it was the level of uncertainty, and still for all of us now, you know, what does the future look like? We don't really know. And this is the first time in our, you know, recent history that we've ever had to deal with something like that. And we still don't know what the outcome's going to be. Are we going to get a vaccine? Jury's out. We may do next year if we're lucky. And it will be for one strain, and they're going to have to keep adapting it. But probably the best thing is going to be a fast test, so you can actually isolate people more, and then you know, protect our vulnerable, and go about business and open the borders up. That's probably what's going to happen. But certainly for young people and a lot of elderly that are stuck at home by themselves, lonely, you know, the future is not very bright. So it's going to be very, very hard to deal with that. I mean, I look at my daughters, for example, right, and they're both really upbeat kids, but they're really suffering for what they have to deal with, the lockdown, the, you know, the reduction in hours, and both of them are essential workers. So it's been really tough. But I think it's that very much that uncertainty about this whole situation that has exacerbated it, because it's the only time that I can think of where you can't see your way through the end of this that easily.
But we can't fix it.
Yeah.
Therefore, if we can't fix it, what do we do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the answer is we have to normalise it. Make sense?
Yeah.
Certainly
We have
does.
to treat it as something that's not. I mean, it's no different. Just before I was talking earlier with a different group, and some of us see COVID-19 as an inconvenience. Some of us view COVID-19 as an oppression. And that's simply based on your filter as to whether you are thoughtful and see it as inconvenience, or righteous and see that you're being oppressed, that the virus came back just to oppress you.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, that
Because
does.
it's us, it's the filter that we use to view things, not what the virus is. The virus is the enemy.
Yeah, that explains the 2 court cases at the start where the guys were saying that the Director of Health and the Prime Minister were locking them up personally. It's oppression. Within the messaging, though, for me, there's 2 elements. There's consistency, and then there's some principles that can be applied from things like organisational change and organisational development. And I'll talk on that one first. One of the things that I learned a few years ago from a lady I used to work with, Carly Orr, she talked about the 7 principles of change. And I can't remember all of them, but one of them she talked about that really stuck with me is the best way to sell any change is to tell people what's not changing. And so if you think about through COVID, and I'll pick on the payroll team, through COVID, when you're sending people from home, that payroll team, you know, you're still going to get information through. You're still going to have timesheets. You're still going to have this. You're still going to have this. You're still going to be processing our payroll. None of this is changing. You still have a job to do. What is changing is you'll be doing that from home, and you'll need to find a way to collaborate from home. But straight away, you've and I've found in talking with Carly more about that, but also researched into it, it actually builds a lot more certainty, because people know, I know what to do for my job. Even to the point where if it's even down to changing buildings. If you're moving buildings, tell them what's not changing. Oh, by the way, we're moving to that building over there. But for me, then the consistency piece is if you tell them that, don't change it without communicating it properly first. So don't suddenly say, oh, there's no payroll data coming through today and we won't get it till Monday. Be consistent and be clear. And a good example of inconsistency was actually the levels across the 2 lockdowns. I remember the first lockdown, Prime Minister was on the radio and it was very clear what the levels were and what we were going to be at and what we were at now. And even my 4-year-old son then in the back of the car went, we're at level 2. We're going to be at level 4 on whenever. The second lockdown, we had level 2.5. And then there was talk of 1.5.
Yeah.
What did that mean?
I mean, what I can share with you is I was seconded 6 days into level 4 to assist MB on the help desk for business as part of a business New Zealand directive. And I got to share with you, we all look at the same shit you were looking at. We used the same website you had. We were dealing with the same change by the hour that you were dealing with. And that makes sense. No, there was no master plan that actually existed at that time. We were all learning from it. But what people wanted is they wanted to talk to someone else who could appreciate them and have that conversation and make them feel that we're all part of, as much as I don't like the political bit, we're all part of the same team trying to move forward that way. Does it make sense? That these government agencies didn't have anything extra that no one else had in that way. Everyone was dealing with a huge amount of uncertainty during that period.
Yeah, and with that, unfortunately, comes a whole lot of human ills too, right? Because we work with the National Telehealth Service. And so we developed the database for them. And we're just building another one for domestic violence because that's gone through the roof as well. So you've got all the helplines being overloaded because of all the anxiety and how do people deal with that. And then you've got violence going up. It's
And who supports the helpline?
well,
Who helps the helpline?
yeah. I mean, they have lots of nurses triaging and stuff, but yeah, yeah.
Guys, I'm just interested in your opinion, and we've talked about culture and organisational change, and one of the key cultures in a lot of, I'm sure, in a lot of New Zealand organisations is the concept of working from home and the trust level. And I work for an organisation where probably a third of our staff are office-based and the rest are out in the field. So there was a heavy push to get everybody back to work because we're an essential service. 2/3 of the staff were back at work, and there was a lot of pressure put on for everyone else to go back to work. Thankfully, I'm in an area where we haven't had a second lockdown, but the reluctance to allow people to work from home as part of an organisational change in culture. What's your opinions on that?
I think any company that hasn't built in place a flexible working policy, because that's probably more what it is. I think working from home was the perk once upon a time. You're allowed to do a day at home or you know, whatever, you can work from home. But a flexible working policy is probably more robust. And there's lessons in, is it Perpetual Guardian that's brought in the 4-day working week? I think it's Perpetual Guardian. Lessons in the way they've done it. They measure productivity. So they have a rule in place that if you're not delivering at 100% across 4 days, you don't get the 5th day. And they have teams that didn't take that up. So that's part of the conversation everyone here and everyone that's not here, need to be driving is actually embrace that flexible working does lower risk. There's lessons in there for some of the big companies, the banks that have a call centre in Auckland and a call centre in Wellington. Why are they putting 200 people in the same building when they could be putting 20 people in 10 different buildings across the country and still, you know, having that same level of productivity? So I think it's just, we've got to look differently to trying to jam everyone into this 1980s, 1970s kind of mindset that presenteeism is the only way that productivity happens.
Yeah, and we didn't learn anything from Christchurch.
No. I think for me, you know, it's been a really interesting exercise personally, because I'm from the era, you know, the baby boomers, where it was really tough for me to work from home because as a director of the organisation, I wanted to be there and I wanted to interact with people. So to force me to go and work from home was a big push, even though my wife told me, you should be more flexible, blah, blah, blah. So I think now we've built in more flexibility for our organisation, and except for certain roles, right? You know, when we've got customer service people that need to specifically be there to do a certain task, then there's less flexibility. But for others, but you know, your comment around trust, I mean, that's a huge issue, isn't it? And I think and the point was made over there about productivity, or somewhere productivity's actually probably increased a lot of the time. But it also, the other part of that from an organisational perspective is that people that work from home for a prolonged period of time, there's no clear delineation from work to home life. So what you end up doing is your working day goes and you get less exercise, and you're not going to the printer and walking backwards and forwards or doing whatever you do, or go to the water cooler or whatever. And so you're actually doing less. You're probably getting yourself in a position where you're going to have some sort of, need some physiotherapy work because you're not getting up and stretching. And so it's about building something into your plan that deals with that, and encouraging people when they are working from home to do all those good hygiene things as well. But certainly I agree with Anthony, building a plan and allowing that flexibility with trust in your people is the way to go for sure.
I had a project about 5 months before COVID-19. I was providing some psychosocial risk management with an IT company that was basically looking to have 95% of its workers working from home or in small clusters. And they were trying to adjust, you know, because they're going on the world stage and all the rest of it. And what we developed for them was a journal system where basically we were able to talk to the workforce about what did an ideal work from home look like. So we set this thing over here. So we created this thing over here. And then we got to assess where they're at in their own mental model. Make sense? And identified what some of the challenges would be. But the important thing here was not only did we have set times where they were able to have that conversation with others, but more importantly, we created a journal so that they could write down how they felt as they went through the journey. And the feedback that I got is the most valuable thing to them was that they could look back and see how far they had come.
Yeah, I think we'll stop it there. We've gone kind of 5 minutes over, but thank you very much. Let's join me in thanking the panelists.